Thing about me, you know that I've been talking a lot about how racism is in Sweden and how racism is affecting a lot of people. Swedes are fond of telling black people, especially we blacks coming from Africa, because that's the majority of blacks that live in Sweden, how we, when we talk about racism, how we have low IQ, how we don't know what we're talking about, how we are not well educated in our countries before we migrate to Sweden. So when we come to Sweden, we start saying that they are racist towards us, whereas they are not racist. Sweden will come and tell you we don't have racism because we are not seen on the news. You don't have racism because you don't pluck out your racism. That's the one thing I've been telling Swedes, that you know why you say you don't have racism, because the racists are in your system and you don't pluck them out. So you lie to the whole world that you don't have racism. Hey guys, so welcome back to Analysis with Jeannet. Here we talk about everything and we discuss about everything. Feel free to share your thoughts and your opinion, but always remember to be polite as you share your thoughts and your opinion in whatever thing you're talking about. So today we are going to be talking about brainwashed, that there is no racism in Sweden. Yes, a lot of you guys out there think, oh, there is no racism in Sweden. Oh, if there was racism in Sweden, people are going to talk about it, because we have this mentality of believing that where there is racism, there's a lot of talk about it. Like people talk about how they're being racial upon, what happened, how the racism occurred, things like that. You barely hear black people talk about how they have been racial upon in Sweden. And so people have created this mentality and they have been brainwashed by the Swedes to believe that, oh, there is no racism in Sweden, because if there was racism, a lot of people talk about it, a lot of people draw people's attention to it. But have you ever thought about maybe Sweden has structural, systemic, and institutional racism, which makes it difficult for a lot of people to talk, because you have to understand something. The thing about structural, institutional, and systemic racism is that it's being done by the government. So the racists are inside the system. The system knows about the racists, so the system ignores the racists. The system does nothing to block out the racists. The system doesn't address the racism. The system makes it look like there is no racism. The racists have enormous power because nobody's addressing them, nobody's plucking them out, nobody's bringing them out there. They are not getting any criticism, nobody's saying anything about them. So it makes it seem like, oh, there is no racism, because if there was racism, people would have talked about it. But I also have to mention this: with structural, institutional, and systemic racism, this is a problem, because it's a system that has allowed the racists to be in the system. So it becomes very difficult for the victims to get a platform. It becomes very difficult for the victims to get a voice. It becomes very difficult for the victims to, for their voices to be heard, because the system that is supposed to empower the victims, the system that is supposed to stand up to help the victims, on the contrary, it is the system that is instead ignoring the victims and then trying to make it look like the victims have a problem. I've been talking a lot about racism. If you know one thing about me, you know that I've been talking a lot about how racism is in Sweden and how racism is affecting a lot of people. And if you really want to understand racism in Sweden, and if you really want to understand how racism works in Sweden, I would say this to you: you can follow my Facebook stroke Instagram account called My Autism Journey in Sweden, where I've been narrating a lot about my autistic brother here in Sweden. And there you see a lot of tapes and videos where you see people working in the Swedish system, how rude, how disrespectful they are, but they still come to work the next day and they still have a job. And that's the thing. And so now it becomes very difficult to fight racism when the government is doing little or nothing to pluck out the racists. And then it creates that mentality out there as, oh, there is no racism in Sweden, because if there was racism in Sweden, we'll see it. And I'll give you a very good example. You can compare Sweden versus America. The difference between Sweden and America when it comes a lot to racism is that Americans are very vocal. They will tell you how this thing happened, that thing happened, this police officer shot a black person, ongoing investigation on this person, but you barely hear anything like that. And it makes you, and if you come to Sweden, you barely hear anything like, oh, an ongoing investigation on this individual for being racist, an ongoing investigation on this person for being racist. On the contrary, nobody investigates the racists. I've been documenting my brother for the past 1 year now in Sweden, where a medical doctor has been malpracticing on him, calling him a criminal for being autistic and having his intellectual disability. And you can follow it on his Facebook stroke Instagram account called My Autism Journey here in Sweden. And I've put several tapes of my family documented, and you haven't seen any ongoing investigation. Oh, an ongoing investigation going on a medical doctor malpracticing. On the contrary, everybody's quiet about it. So as everybody's quiet about her, then the question is, how many more people are like her in the system that everybody's quiet about, nobody's talking about, nobody's addressing, nobody's calling anybody's attention to? So you see, and then it makes it look like, oh, there is no racism in Sweden, because if there was racism, people would talk about. But have you ever thought about that? There is racism, but the government has chosen not to address it. Because that's one of the reasons why I created that platform, My Autism Journey in Sweden, to document my brother, to show you guys how much Swedish government does little or nothing to address racism. And then they give you that mentality of believing that America has one of the worst racism in the world, because Americans will document their racism, they will put it out there, they'll go on the streets, they'll protest, they'll talk about how how racism is affecting the society, affecting black people. Yeah, in Sweden, we don't talk about things like that. It's even if it's like a taboo to talk about it. If you start talking about racism in Sweden, they'll tell you how you don't know what you're talking about. Especially people, especially somebody like myself that I'm coming from Africa. I've been told so many times in Sweden that I have low IQ because I narrate stories of racism in Sweden. I remember the first time I was told that I had low IQ in Sweden. I remember vividly. I was talking about my autistic brother that was being abused in Sweden, which you can follow on his Facebook stroke Instagram account called My Autism Journey in Sweden. And I was talking about how he's being treated, that the manner in which he's being treated is a racist one, and that it needs to stop. And I was told, because we're sitting in a meeting concerning my brother, and you know what the people in the meeting said to me? I think it was this doctor, social worker, and it was a case manager in the meeting, my mom or myself, and they said to me, you Africans that have gone to school in Africa, sometimes when you migrate to Sweden, to a country like Sweden that is well civilized, you have a hard time blending into our society. So you tend to racism, and then you become a bitter and an angry person. Because one thing you have to know here in Sweden is that there's no racism here in Sweden. And whatever thing that Emmanuel, that's the name of my autistic brother, whatever thing that he's going through, it has nothing to do with racism, Janet. There is no racism here in Sweden. So can you stop using the word racism? Because there's no racism here in Sweden. Sweden is not like America where black people are being racial upon. And I was like, are you kidding me? And let me tell you something. I was shocked because you know why? Actually, my autistic brother is being racial upon. And then you have the racist telling you to your face how, oh, there is no racism. That's not racism. It's not a racial thing. Just because he's treated differently, just because he's been punished for his disability, just because he's been, they treat him, they take his disability to torture him, doesn't mean it's racist. It just means that's how it's supposed to be. And I tell you something, things like this are the reason why a lot of time people feel that there's no racism, because most often Swedes are fond of telling black people, especially we blacks coming from Africa, because that's the majority of blacks that live in Sweden, how when we talk about racism, how we have low IQ, how we don't know what we're talking about, how we are not well educated in our countries before we migrate to Sweden. So when we come to Sweden, we start saying that they are racist towards us, whereas they are not racist. I remember when I went to school in Sweden, and I remember I was taught in the Swedish schools that there's nothing like racism. And let me tell you something. I had this lesson, I think it was my social lesson. I cannot remember exactly. And then I remember my teacher sat there. We're talking about racism, right? We're all talking about racism, talking about how racism is affecting everybody. Like, you have to talk about it, racism. So, you know what my teacher said? This is exactly what she said. She said, today we're going to talk about racism, but there's no racism here in Sweden. But you guys are going to watch it. I think it was a 20 or 22-minute video talking about the different forms of racism in America. Now, when you're done watching those videos, we're going to divide you guys into smaller groups where you're going to discuss it. And then at the end of the class, we all are going to come together and discuss what we have understood about the video. Yes, that's what my teacher said in class. And the video, we watched a 22 or 20-minute video. I cannot remember exactly how long, but it was around that time. She divided us into smaller groups. And I'll tell you something, the whole time we talked about American racism. We never talked about how racism affects black people here in Sweden, the different forms of racism here in Sweden. All we did that day in the lesson was talk about the different forms of racism in America. And I remember when we came back together in class, and when everybody come back together, I said something. I said, why is it that we didn't talk about racism here in Sweden? Because I asked my teacher, I was like, you know what? We need to talk about racism here in Sweden. Racism too in Sweden. And you know what she said to me? Janet, there is no racism here in Sweden. Racism is more in America. That's why we didn't talk about racism here in Sweden. So now I started narrating my brother's story. So I told her, I said, there is racism here in Sweden. And I said, I have evidence to prove that there is racism here in Sweden. Because at the time, my brother had been judged indefinitely as a criminal for being autistic and having his intellectual disability. So I said to the lady, I said, let me tell you something. In 2014, my brother's finger was stabbed by a Swedish boy in one of the group homes that he lived in. And in the Stockholm court here in Sweden, told my family that my brother doesn't have the psychological capacity to stand in court and get justice for his finger. So they are not going to bring him to court to testify or talk about what happened because of his autism and intellectual disability. So the case was dropped. In 2018, my family gets a letter from the Holdinge police station here in Stockholm saying that police officers are pressing charges on my brother because they were called to help my brother, because my brother has autism and intellectual disability, and because of he has autism level 2, he has this tendency of getting stuck in a place. And normally when he gets stuck in a place, you can call the police to come and assist you to get him out. So the police was called. When the police arrived, they pressed charges on him, saying that he resisted and he fought them. And then guess what? The Södertörns court here in Sweden, in Stockholm, picked up that case, took my brother to court in the Södertörns court, told my brother, judged my brother as a criminal and sentenced him indefinitely. And you know, indefinite sentence means there's no time. That means he's sentenced for the rest of his life. So for the rest of his life, he was sentenced indefinitely to the Swedish maximum psychiatric facilities, Kasjuden. And let me tell you something. Kasjuden is a center made for hardened criminals in Sweden. If you remember the person that they accused of killing the Swedish Prime Minister here in Sweden, Olof Palme. I don't know if you know the story about Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister that got killed in Sweden. You know, there was a suspect, somebody that they suspected that killed him. That guy was sent to Kasjuden. That's a center for hardened criminals in Sweden. That's a center meant for hardened criminals. They are not even meant for regular criminals. So when you have gone to Kasjuden, that means you are a hardened criminal in Sweden. That's where they put the suspect, that the person that is suspected for killing the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme. He was put in Kasjuden. So you take an autistic boy that they told us when his finger was stabbed that he doesn't have the psychological capacity to stand in court and get justice for his finger. You take him now and sentence him indefinitely to the Swedish maximum psychiatric facilities, Kasjuden, putting him there as the worst criminal for his disability. And I said that to my teacher. I said, that is racism. So if you want to say there's no racism in Sweden, why was my brother not given justice when his finger was stabbed? And then when he had his disability, and then they turn around and punish him for his disability, that is racism. So Sweden does have racism. You cannot come in class and tell us how there's no racism. I know what she said to me. She said, Janet, that's your personal story. You cannot bring your personal story to class, you know. And a lot of my classmates were really interested because they wanted to know. They were like, Janet, that's true. That is racism in Sweden. And my teacher she got really offended with me because she felt like I brought my personal story to class. But you know why I brought my personal story to class? Because she sat there and lied to the students and lied to me how there's no racism in Sweden. Whereas my brother is being sentenced indefinitely as a criminal for being autistic and having intellectual disability. And this is a narrative that Sweden puts out there all the time. Oh, we don't have racism. Oh, there is no racism here in Sweden. But there's a lot of racism here in Sweden. And the bad thing is that they have put it in the school curriculum. They teach it even in the schools. They tell the teachers to teach it in schools how there is no racism in Sweden. I was shocked because I went to school in Cameroon, and in Cameroon we don't have racism. We have tribalism, we have nepotism, we have discrimination, but we don't have racism. But I was taught racism in school in Cameroon. I was taught that there's something called racism, where people are treated differently based on their skin colors, and it has to do more often with countries where black and white people have to share the same system. And then just to come to Sweden, where black and white people have to share the same system, and then you have a teacher standing in front of a classroom and telling me how there is no racism in Sweden because there's no racism, and she's teaching it. And then I start to ask, how many more students has that teacher taught like that? And that is the narrative that Sweden puts out there, telling everybody how, oh, we don't have racism, there is no racism. I'm a student. When I come to school, I'm supposed to learn about my surroundings. I'm supposed to learn about what is going on around me. You're not supposed to teach me something that is a lie. Means at the end of the day, what happens to your racists in your country, Sweden? They don't get punished. That's why a medical doctor is malpracticing right now with my brother, and she's not been investigated because you have taught in your schools how there's no racism. That means racists can work quietly, get paid, get a salary in Sweden, and they still get a job because you are lying to people. And that's why I say this, that sometimes a lot of you out there would think, oh, there's no racism here in Sweden because you don't hear people talk about it. No, there's a lot of racism. There is a lot of racism. But the thing is that in Sweden, they don't teach it in their schools. They remove it from the school curriculum. They don't teach racism in Swedish schools, especially if it has to do with them. If they're going to teach racism, they're going to teach about other countries. Like the example I gave you about in school in Sweden, where I was taught about racism in America, but not racism in Sweden. They'll teach you about how the different forms of racism in America, but they'll never teach you the different forms of racism here in Sweden and how it's affecting black people to migrate into Sweden. They don't teach those things. And that's why people think that there's no racism, because Sweden is not talking about it. But what you don't know is that the bad thing is that Sweden has the worst form of racism, which is structural, systemic and institutional racism. And because these two forms of racism, the bad thing about it is that it's the government promoting it. The people, the racists, are inside the system. So the government has opened its system to the racists. And that's why most often people don't hear about racism here in Sweden. They think like, oh, if there was racism, they would have talked about it. You know, in America, the difference is that you guys in America, you pluck out your racists. You be like a medical doctor, police officer shot a black person. They go there, they remove that police officer from work. But we don't do that here in Sweden. We don't do that here. You can be a white person and be a racist, and you still have a job in Sweden. And even with all the evidence that is showing that you're a racist, nobody's going to stop you. Even with all the evidence that my family has documented a medical doctor malpracticing here in Sweden, which you can see it on my brother's Facebook Instagram account called My Autism Journey in Sweden. Even with all that evidence, still yet nobody has gone to investigate that lady. So that lady is sitting there as a medical doctor. How many more black people is she malpracticing on? And every day Sweden will come and tell you, we don't have racism because we are not seen on the news. You don't have racism because you don't pluck out your races. That's the one thing I've been telling Swedes, that you know why you say you don't have racism, because the races are in your system and you don't pluck them out. So you lie to the whole world that you don't have racism because you don't pluck out your races. The difference between Sweden and America is that America will bring out the races. They will want to get to the bottom. They want to bring your police officer, show your police officer that I shot a black person. Yes, Sweden, we don't do that. On the contrary, we lie how there is no racism. There is no racism. We don't have racism, but there's a lot of racism. And these are things that we need to understand, because most black people out of Sweden feel like when you're a black person living in Sweden, you don't get to face racism because you don't hear breaking news of racial cases. But there's a lot of racism. There are a lot of black people that have been abused. My family is currently facing racism, but have you seen any breaking news on it on the TV? Have you seen that? You will not see any breaking news. And it's not only my family. A lot of other families are like my family that have been currently being racial upon here in Sweden, and there's no talk about it. And just because there's no talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. If not because my family choose to document us, put out there, it might seem like, oh, there's no racism because the government is not talking about it. When last did the Swedish government say breaking news, or Swedish channels or Swedish journalists wrote about a story of a black person being racial upon? No, let me tell you something. Just because Swedish government and the Swedish journalists don't write about stories about racism doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just shows how structural, systemic, and institutional racism is going on quietly in Sweden, and how it's helping a lot of racists to get away with their racist act and not get caught or not get held accountable for their action. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and don't forget to like, share, comment, and as you share your thoughts and your comments, always remember to be respectful, because here we share our thoughts and comments, but we are also respectful. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you guys again in my next video. Bye guys.